Rob Bucket Hingley has led the Toasters through 10 studio albums and almost 40 years and several thousand gigs. Buck, thank you very much for taking this call.
Yeah, Mark. Well, I was very happy to do this with you and help promote Scavenor a little bit there and your festival you got going. Since we can't do anything in person at the moment, so may as well come live and direct from my living room in Texas.
I appreciate that. How are things in Texas at the moment?
Pretty grim, man. We're making a bid to be the worst affected state in the country after we were in a pretty good position earlier on, but because the governor here is a complete asswipe and didn't do what he was supposed to do. Basically, the problem is that the virus has become politicized here, and even after 9 months and 222,000 dead Americans, we can't even decide if it's a good idea to wear a mask or not. So we haven't exactly got very far here.
And are there times like that where, you kind of think to yourself, oh, maybe England might be a better proposition than the States at the moment? Do you ever think of going back to the UK?
Well, not really. I mean, I left England in 1980 when Margaret Thatcher was in, and I swore I'd never go back while she was still in power. And she stood me off for 12 years. And now I wouldn't go back. I think what you got now is worse than she was, believe it or not.
It'd be hard to find somewhere that you could go back to, but I think Mexico has been treating you guys well, hasn't it? As a country to go and play in, you seem to be enjoying Mexico, or you have at least in the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, we go down there a lot. It's not very far from where I am. I'm 3 hours from the border here in San Antonio. But the Mexican ska scene is something else, and we do festivals down there in Mexico City with 12,000 people showing up for an indoor show. So there's a lot of really great bands there and a lot of really good promoters, and the people down there are fantastic. South of the border, South America generally, people are well into ska music, and it's doesn't really get a lot of attention in terms of people understanding how big the scene is there. But I recommend anybody to go check it out. Plus the food is awesome, so what's not to like?
Mentioned that the Toasters 39 years on the road. Man, if this year doesn't put pay to it, no year will. Has this been the toughest year yet for you guys as a band, or for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were all set up. I mean, this year was going to be the tour. This year was going to be called the 44 Decades in Ska Tour, and we were going to carry it over into next year when it would be the 40-year celebration. But of course, all that's got shot down in flames. I can't even travel to Europe at the moment because of the travel ban on Americans, and doesn't seem much point flying into London and having to spend 2 weeks in quarantine. So we've pushed everything off until next year, essentially. So it'll have to be 2021 and not 2020.
I think this year doesn't count. I think we can write this one off. I think even in terms of birthdays and stuff, we'll cancel this one. And what would a year like for the Toasters? Like, I mean, you do a lot of gigs. I mentioned at the start, like several thousand gigs. What would a year look like generally in terms of gigs? How many gigs would you on average be clocking up in a year, in a good year?
Well, I got one tour in the US in January, February, and the last date I played was February 29, which was the leap year, and I haven't played since. But what I have been doing is cancelling shows, and between March 1st and now, I've cancelled 150 concerts.
Wow, 150. So that would have been, and that's not even a year's worth. That's everything.
That's everything. Okay. That'll be everything through the rest of this year, and the US tour that was going to be in January, February, but which is now not. So basically, I will have had like a whole year off and 150 cancelled concerts.
And how are you doing income-wise then? Because that's your bread and butter.
Well, shite to be frank, but there's people helping support us on the merchandise sites a little bit. But being a self-employed musician, it's very hard to make an unemployment claim because they can't figure out what I do. So the state of Texas is still figuring out whether I'm eligible for benefits or not, even though we have a program here in the States that's supposed to be for gig workers. And I said, well, who's the consummate gig worker is me. But, I'm going back and forward with them. But, fortunately, my wife has got a good job. And I saw something coming, so I put some money in the bank last year, and good job. So I'm just living off that at the moment.
Okay, and sorry to hear that now, and hopefully that the merch thing is going well. And fingers crossed, we will get back to this, and hopefully we get back sooner rather than later. How have you been spending your time then? If that time and energy, not just that you would put into those gigs that you would have had, but the traveling, the rehearsal, what have you been doing with that time?
Yeah, well, it's kind of really hard to do anything musically related because my band, of course, is spread across the states. I've got guys in California, guys in Virginia, so it's not possible to get the band together to do anything really. And so my garden is looking great, and
Yeah.
and the house has been painted, and that list of really annoying things I've been meaning to get to for the last 10 years, I'm pretty much through with that. So what I decided to do, I mean, the whole thing has been so depressing, the amount of work involved in just deconstructing a tour after you set up 2 or 3 tours, having to get back in touch with everybody and push it back off. I mean, that's been a lot of work. But I just decided to step away from the business and call 2020 my sabbatical, and just not think about it, because the whole thing is like pretty crushing when you think about it.
Yeah, and I don't mean to depress you. I'll bring things up. We go down. We bring things up because not only are you somebody who plays in a band and the frontman with the Toasters, but back in '81, you became a record label boss, a small record label, but a record label boss, and you still are. It's Megalith Records now. But when you started Moonscar Records, like that must be difficult now as well, having a record label. But with Moonscar, you released most of the Toasters work through that, and you had association with the Slackers, and Less Than Jake and No Doubt were associated with the label there for a while. Was it tough wrapping up that label when you did back in 2004, was it?
2000 for Moon. It was really difficult, but there was a combination of factors going on at that time that made it pretty impossible to continue with the label. One of them was the fact that during the 90s, ska music got pretty popular in the mainstream and kind of became flavor of the week. And so what happened with that, along with a lot more people being interested in ska music, it also drew the attention of a lot of major labels and a lot of players who were pumping money into the scene. So the cost of doing business for indie labels such as Moon got sky high. We couldn't compete with bigger labels, cherry picking our bands and stealing our bands basically. But then when 2 things happened in 1999, one was the collapse of most of the big independent distributors who were distributing indie labels. And the biggest of those was Caroline, who was our biggest client and shifting most of our catalog. They got bought by EMI, and we just got a letter saying, well, we're not going to distribute you anymore. And here's a tractor trailer of an 18-wheeler of all your records that we're sending back to you and claiming a credit. So I think more than any one thing, I think that put us out of business because we were faced with the prospect of having to work for 2 or 3 years without any income. And that I just didn't see that as viable. But at the same time, ska music stopped being flavor of the week. And the operation we had with Moon, we were having the store, and it was just untenable from a financial point. So we had to wrap it up. And I wanted to go out while we're still ahead instead of like really having 3 terrible years and it ending up being a terrible experience instead of an uplifting one. But that was a little label that could, and we did a lot with that label.
Yeah, you really did. And with Megalith now as well, one of the bands that I see on that is the Pannonia All-Star Ska Orchestra from the Balkans. Great band. So how's Megalith doing?
Well, kind of slow at the moment. And what has happened there, of course, is like with so many bands having broken up, it's become pretty much like an incubator for the Toasters back catalog. And I put out a record for bands here and there. I mean, the last record I did for that wasn't the Toasters was Cartoon Violence, the Welsh band. Are you familiar with them?
Yeah, I've heard of Cartoon Violence, yeah.
I put a vinyl out for them, but it's kind of got few and far between with the releases now. I mean, I think essentially the role of record labels is a very difficult one because the whole traditional way of making money off your catalog has disappeared. And it's very hard to compete with the live streams and platforms like Spotify, which don't really remunerate you for the cost of producing a record. So it's very hard to, having produced a record for somebody, it's really, really hard to make your money back.
I've read you describe Spotify as vultures, and
Yeah, they're terrible, terrible. I mean, from the point of view of a music consumer, as a music consumer myself, they have a great selection, and I can pretty much listen to anything I want. But from the artist's perspective, it's terrible because the artist doesn't get paid. And I think it's fair to expect, as an artist, that platforms like Spotify or Google Music or Amazon Music, they're all as bad. I would like to see them cutting the artists in for a bigger share of the profits, just to support the art and maintain the flow of product, but they don't really want to do that.
And does it gall you that you're expected to put your back catalogue up there now, because it's how a lot of people are consuming music? Does that grate a little bit?
Well, it's a two-edged sword. I mean, you can choose to pull your catalogue off there if you want, but because the tool these guys use to get hold of your back catalogue is called a compulsory mechanical license. And this is basically what you would pay to a publisher for the rights to cover their tune. So they're getting the rights through legislation that was introduced to cover piano rolls back in the day. So that legislation's like over 120 years old. So they're using a 120-year-old loophole in the law to put your music on their platforms, and then you have to sue them to take it back off. So Taylor Swift can do that. Bucket from the Toasters can't afford to do that. And on the other side, it's there is a certain amount of promotional value having it up, but I think people should understand that bands having their catalog on there, you can't eat promotion. But fortunately, what we do is try to get people into the live gigs. But of course, that's gone at the moment. So it's like really terrible position for musicians, and I feel greatly for the touring bands because they're suffering greatly.
Let's bring it up a little bit. And one of the things that strikes me in looking at the history of the Toasters was getting Two-Tone Army used on a Nickelodeon series. That must have been a nice little boost, was it?
Yeah, that was great. I mean, it was funny how that happened. I mean, that was one of the advantages of having a record label in New York, because the MTV guys used to come down all the time to the shop and pick stuff up. And the story on that was that show originally, the guy, I can't remember the name of the creator, but he'd wanted to have a Bad Manners soundtrack because he was a big ska fan. And when Bad Manners declined, the guys from MTV called us up and said, "Look, you want to do this?" And it was such a fun show when they showed me the pro reels that instead of just writing the theme tune, we provided all the bumper music as well, all the like little 10-minute bumper songs and sound bites. And so that ended up being 80 pieces of music we produced for them. And that was a lot of fun to do.
And breeding a whole new generation of ska fans as well. Did your own kids find a new appreciation for your work through that medium?
Not them, because they were too young in the 90s to catch that show. But you'd be surprised how many people come up to me at shows and say, I first discovered your band by listening to that show on Nickelodeon. And so that just shows to me, proves to me in hindsight, the power of television over young minds. So the amount of people who say that was their portal getting into ska music, for the Toasters in particular, but ska music in general, is pretty overwhelming. I was shocked actually how many people have said that over the years.
And I talked to you about your own portal into music, how you got into music yourself. Am I right in saying that you have a soft spot for Chuck Berry?
Yeah, I was a big Chuck Berry fan. My father had a lot of those records when I was a kid, and he would do a big fry up every weekend, Saturday or Sunday morning, and he'd get a whole bunch of 7-inches and stick them on his record machine, stack them up on his record machine. And Chuck Berry was a frequent selection with him. He liked Gene Vincent, he liked Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, a lot of those great 50s arts, Everly Brothers, people like this. So I grew up listening to that, and I actually got to meet him personally one time in St. Louis Airport. I was coming back. It had been the last day of the tour, and the tour ended in St. Louis, so I was taking the plane back, and I met him in the airport. And I had this shirt on at the time that said "Stop Whining," which is my tour manager's shirt. And I was sitting there in the airport, and it had been such a drag to get in, because at that point they had all this Homeland Security nonsense going on, and there had been a wrestling convention, like a WWF convention in St. Louis. So the whole airport was full of these wrestlers and people thronging them. So it was just such a pain in the ass getting through security. I came through with a little, dark cloud, thunder cloud over my head, and I was sitting at the gate. And this guy across says to me, "Oh man, I got to get me that shirt." So I look up and I see this older black guy, and I said, "Yeah, I made this so special. You'd have to special order it." And he goes, "Oh man, I really like it." And I was looking at the guy, and I was thinking, I know this guy. He's got a purple crush full of. Hi, I know who you are. I know you are. And as I'm thinking this is all happening over a period of 15 to 20 seconds. Some guy from the airline comes over and says, "Oh well, I'm sorry, I wasn't able to get you on the first class to Miami or St. Pete, somewhere in Florida where he was going. But we have you these tickets, and Mr. and Mrs. Charles Berry." And I'm fuck, it's very sad. I felt like just like ripping my shirt off and giving it to him, but I went over and said, "Oh, big fan." So it's pretty.
Yeah, you have to be careful there, though, don't you? Because I mean, legend has it, and I remember watching that. Was it called Hail Hail Rock and Roll, where Keith Richards organised the gig for him, and he ended up giving him a slap backstage. Like he has a pretty fierce reputation, Chuck Berry, or he did at least.
Yeah. He's got a hell of a reputation, but I mean, what an icon! But just meeting him,
yeah.
Like that, it was funny. And when the penny dropped, I was like, "Oh goodness me, that's Chuck Berry." That was a great moment.
Maybe he went onto the plane and said, "You'll never guess who I met in the airport." I met Bucket in the airport.
Yeah, I don't think Chuck Berry knows who I am, but I did write a song about him, so you can check that out on the "Don't Let the Bastards Grind You Down" record. I mean, I think all those guys, the contribution they had to ska music is kind of unrecognized by a lot of fans. But I mean, them, Chuck Berry and guys like Louis Jordan, Jump Blues, all those rock and roll players and jump blues players was such a big influence on the Jamaican musicians at the time.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. I read about the influence that somebody like Fats Domino had in the creation of ska, Mento kind of bringing in that rock and roll. And yet sometimes you read, and I don't know, is it something that was ever brought up with you, is the idea of cultural appropriation, that is it right to be playing a style of music that originated in Jamaica, but did it originate in Jamaica, or is everything cross-pollinated? What's your viewpoint on that, this idea of, cultural appropriation?
Well, that's for me, that's something that's a bit of a gray area, because I mean, appreciating somebody's music and playing it, for me, is far more important than having some political stance that you can't play this because of that. I mean, I think that would have stopped a great many musical forms from starting. But the thing about the Jamaican guys is they were listening to all this stuff on the airwaves coming down from New Orleans, for example, and obviously the big bands like Fats Domino and Count Basie. These were massive influences on the Jamaican guys. And I was on tour one time with Lester Sterling. He was playing in the Toasters at that time, 1996. And he was my roommate. So we used to stay up after the show, and he'd bust out a can of sardines and some crackers. And he'd tell me just about the old days in Jamaica and how it used to be. And the thing I learned from him, Lester, is that number one, every single Jamaican guy thinks that they invented ska music, so they're not going to agree on where that came from. And I was asking him, because Lester was the guy who was widely acknowledged as being the guy who invented that horn upbeat, the horn chop. And I said, "Where'd you get that from?" And he said, "Buck, you got to listen to what the guitar player of the Boots Randolph big band is playing, and you'll and you'll understand what I mean. And in particular, the Benny Hill tune, you know, it's a ska beat underneath. And Lester said he got the idea for that horn chop from listening to that tune. So there's the direct example of the influence of the music on the Jamaicans. And of course, the Jamaicans add some rum and their own little, their version of the mento or the buru drums or whatever, and make their own thing out of it. But, you know, it was their approximation of jazz and rock and roll.
Yeah, and that's great. And what an insight to get. And I love the image of, you know, you talk about the rock and roll lifestyle, but a tin of sardines on the bed with Lester Sterling. I love that. That's class. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's a nice way to spend an evening.
Don't get much better than that, huh?
No, and I mean, it doesn't get much better than that, really, does it? You know, and it leads into the question I wanted to finish up with. I mean, what part of being out on the road do you miss much? That's a lovely image, you know, and you think of huge stadiums and sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but something like that sounds like a really nice thing to do.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people have the wrong image about rock and roll, that somehow it's this big glamorous thing. But I mean, people in the touring bands work really hard, get up early in the morning, drive a long way, and then you have to hurry up and wait where you get to the venue and you're twiddling your thumbs. I mean, I could see why so many people develop alcohol habits or drug habits, because they got all this time on their hands. But I think the thing I miss is like really the traveling and being in a different city every day, and just really getting away from the 9 to 5. I wouldn't even know what to do if I had to go get a regular job now, that's for sure.
Yeah. Well, Puck, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and fingers crossed, and hopefully we get to see the Toasters out on the road very early in 2021.
I hope so. Well, I'm talking to Johnny McKee up in Dublin, so I'm hoping to get across to Ireland. But just as a corollary, the show that I'm giving to Owen for the festival is from that Lester Sterling tour, 1996, at the Whiskey A Go Go in Los Angeles. So that's the clip he's getting from me.
Nice one. I'm hoping that in the world of Chinese whispers, that somebody looks at this and says after this interview, I never knew Benny Hill invented ska music.
Well, it's like seven steps to Kevin Bacon, you know.
Yeah. Nice one, Buck. Take it easy. Mark. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.